On the one hand, this is a culture that privileges only the present and the immediate. The extirpation of the long term extends backwards as well as forwards in time. On the other hand, it is a culture that is excessively nostalgic, given over to retrospection, incapable of generating any authentic novelty.
One of the very first shots of Stranger Things Season 2 focuses on the house of the wealthy Wheeler family, situated on a picturesque suburban block in the fictional town of Hawkins, Indiana. Prominently featured in this establishing shot is a 1984 Reagan-Bush presidential campaign sign. The inclusion of this lawn sign will be among the last times that any contemporary politics are explicitly depicted in the Stranger Things universe. The 2010s in the United States were heavily influenced by 80s era nostalgia, particularly in popular culture. You might be familiar with the 30-year cycle, which is often defined as the phenomenon in which trends from the past resurface every 30 years or so. But I feel 2010s era 80s nostalgia was much more literal. It wasn't that trends or styles from the 80s became popular again in a straightforward, unironic way, but rather that the 80s themselves suddenly became attractive to modern audiences. The 1980s weren't emulated but recreated directly. That meant that we didn't just reboot franchises of the 1980s, although there was some of that, but the decade became a popular choice for setting new stories. And considering the fact that the 80s were, 30 years old at that point, our memories of that time are fuzzy, if we were even alive during the decade at all. We rely on television, movies, music videos, and commercials to define that decade in our collective consciousness. As a result, TV and films made to reflect that era can very easily end up a copy of a copy, sharing little in common with the actual 1980s and instead feeling more like a modern alternate universe, an amalgamation of different 1980s cultural touchstones. Stranger Things is not only the most obvious example of this era's trend of 80s nostalgia, it got popular so quickly it's actually hard to tell how much it rode the wave versus contributed to the trend itself. It's also a clear example of nostalgia-based filmmaking informed by mass media of the decade, not first-hand memories. It's a misconception that Stranger Things was born out of nostalgia for the 1980s. It spawned out of nostalgia for 80s movies. It was created by Matt and Ross Duffer, who were born in 1984. They literally weren't alive the year that the first season is set, and they would have been 5 at the time that the series concluded. But they grew up watching sci-fi, horror, and adventure movies and TV of that time, and their influence is apparent when you watch the first season especially. Over the course of the show's 5 seasons, however, its relationship to the rest of the culture changed. Stranger Things went from being a modest miniseries made by a filmmaking duo genuinely passionate about the story to a cultural juggernaut and flagship program of the most profitable television streaming service. Other franchises have gone through similar processes and handled it relatively well, not letting the profitability of the endeavor have too many untoward effects on the creative side of things. I don't think it's controversial to say that Stranger Things was not one of them. The quality of the show's writing dramatically dropped over seasons, but I want to hone in on how it impacted the use of its time setting. It really had 2 main effects. Firstly, the show eventually learns to avoid inspiring too many negative or complicated feelings about this time period in American history. Secondly, partially as a result of that first effect, the way in which it uses its time setting shifts from being authentic and well-rounded to leaning hard on aesthetic details and especially pop culture references. It went from using the 1980s in order to set the tone and tell a specific story in a particular time and place to depicting that era and all of its cultural signifiers with nothing but reverence, which it had to do because the goal wasn't now just to transport the audience to that era, but to make them feel nostalgic for it, which means that they by definition could not make the audience uncomfortable. But before we get into how later seasons of the show struggle to depict the 1980s in an interesting and appealing way, let's talk about how the show once excelled at that very task.
At first glance, nostalgia is a longing for a place, but actually it is a yearning for a different time, the time of our childhood, the slower rhythms of our dreams. In a broader sense, nostalgia is a rebellion against the modern idea of time, the time of history and progress.
It's safe to say that Stranger Things was created by 2 guys who, despite likely having few direct memories of it, are clearly passionate about this era. Season 1 and to a certain extent Season 2 are a minimally mitigated vision of the 80s in film through the Duffer Brothers' eyes, the platonic ideal of the sci-fi action-adventure stories they grew up on. I actually think this is where the time and place setting rings the most true, and I say rings true as opposed to is accurate because obviously my own first-hand knowledge of the era is non-existent. But from surface-level details like the hairstyles and fashion to subtle practices like the latchkey-esque lifestyles of the kids to the physical environments like the faux wood paneling in the households, it just all feels authentic. None of these things demanded attention, but they all work together to make you feel like you're watching real people from another real time. It feels like a universe that people live in. While this portrayal of the 80s is well informed, it's nearly uncritical. To me, it seems that the Duffers accepted a lot of the tropes and messaging of movies from their childhood without deeper questions. For example, their depiction of a small-town cop as a complicated but lovable lone wolf action hero rips straight from 80s cop shows. The big bad, being the inhumane federal and state governments, is absolutely reminiscent of action or thriller movies of that time, which themselves were informed by contemporary fears towards big government. Now, I don't know if the Duffers genuinely see no problem with these trends, or if they just said, whatever, it's our show, let's just lean into the era and have fun with it. But regardless, for this one season, I don't think it's that bad. That kind of unintentional messaging, it's a little shallow, but the bigger and more important themes of the show are personal and individual. It's a pretty simple 8-episode miniseries about grief, redemption, and friendship. So the show doesn't dive into the political implications of the material it takes inspiration from, but seasons 1 and 2 don't shy away from political references. They just don't really say anything about those politics. In fact, politics go a long way in establishing the setting just as the aesthetic details do. Take when Eleven turns on the TV and briefly sees Ronald Reagan speaking about Lebanon and Syria. It's a cultural reference placed alongside an episode of He-Man and an old-school Coca-Cola commercial. It's not there for political commentary, it's there to indicate the time frame. In the first 2 seasons, characters commonly mention commies, Ruskies, and the Soviets, but these Cold War references are largely value neutral. The individual characters' opinions on foreign policy are left unsaid, but the Cold War looms ever present in the background of their lives, which is true to the time period. Starting in season 2, the writers will occasionally use contemporary politics for character and world building in a realistic way. Most obviously, the Wheeler family is not only pro-Reagan, which yeah, but also in the second episode of season 2, which flashes back to the immediate aftermath of the first season, Ted Wheeler pledges his family's secrecy on the order of the federal agents, saying, "We're all patriots here." It's one of the only arguably anti-American, and I use that term very loosely, lines in the show. Ted Wheeler is portrayed as an unsympathetic character, a bad husband, and a barely present father. That's very straightforward in the early seasons. He's also a loyal American, and the picture of the American nuclear family patriarch. It makes sense that the only wealthy white male adult in the show is the one who is the most checked out of all the action of the story, while his wife, teenage daughter, and young son, whose friends all belong to different minority groups, are much more suspicious.
This girl, what has she done?
I'm afraid I can't answer that.
Oh my God, is she Russian?
In this scene, in which he swears allegiance to the government entity that targeted the main characters, including his son, and tortured a little girl for years, all of these things are tied together, and we get the only parsable political commentary of the early seasons. Uncritical loyalty to your country will mean having to be okay with some pretty messed up shit, and you have to be both apathetic and a little stupid to fall for that propaganda. Maybe it could only happen if you were part of this small intersection of the most privileged groups in society, the ones whose interests were actually represented by Reagan's government. However, this was a passing moment, and the remainder of season 2 is politically disjointed to say the least. There's 3 characters outside of the Wheeler family whose politics we know of, and first of all, there's Dustin's mom, who has a Mondale sign in her front yard. This automatically gives her the best politics in the entire show, but also Claudia Henderson is portrayed in this very season to be doofy and silly. She's a lonely single mom devoted to her cat and easily manipulated by her 13-year-old son. A weird contrarian loner is exactly what the average 2026 viewer would assume the average Mondale voter to be. But realistically speaking, the Sinclairs were much more likely to have been Mondale supporters. Mondale got 91% of the black vote in 1984, but portraying race politics that explicitly is something Stranger Things was never going to do. So Mrs. Henderson being a Mondale supporter is a kind of funny political joke for modern viewers, but it's not a real comment on the politics of the era, and it's arguably anachronistic. Then there's the character of Murray Bauman. In season 2, he is portrayed to be a paranoid conspiracy theorist verging on insane, but his leading theory on all the crazy shit going down in Hawkins is that Eleven is not a tool of the US government, which she was, but a Russian spy. And I was surprised to see a giant American flag hanging in his house. When you boil it down, he's afraid of communist Russia and loyal to his country. I don't know enough about the typical conspiracy theorists in 1984 to know if they were anti-American at large, but I do think it's odd to portray him as having the same mainstream political opinions as, Ted Wheeler. Lastly, there's the punk crew in episode 7. I almost skipped episode 7 on rewatch, but I'm glad that I watched it, because then I would have missed the line.
We're only stealing from the war criminal billionaires who own this place. We won't even lose a dime.
I said stay back.
We're on the same side.
We're only stealing from the war criminal billionaires who own the place. And what am I even supposed to say about that? Are we supposed to think that these characters are in the right, that their politics are good? Are we supposed to put any serious thought into them? Did the writers? It's genuinely hard to parse what the show even wants us to think about these characters, and honestly, would you blame me if I just gave up trying? Other than that, there are more vague references to Reagan, like literally in name only, and that's about it. It's almost like they want to remind the audience that high-stakes politics is happening in the background, but rarely comment on it at all. The best example of a character articulating a political viewpoint that the show itself seems to co-sign is Paul Reiser's character, who's a genuinely trustworthy figure, arguing that the US would be more ethical about the Upside Down than the USSR. And it's like, I know this character is an agent of the US government and thus likely to say something like that, but I think the writers of the show are just as biased. They hold the very common belief that while the US government is corrupt and flawed and scary, it is also better than the mysterious foreign alternative. Despite Season 2 focusing the most on the failures of the US government, maybe tied with Season 1, it stopped short of being anti-American. To be clear, I don't want the characters to commentate on 80s politics like a modern lefty. At all. I will spend a lot of this video discussing the political implications of the show because sometimes it wanders into that territory, but I'm not judging the show based on the morals and beliefs that the characters espouse. Just the opposite. I would actually appreciate it if some of these characters had, worse politics. I'm just asking for the writers to put a little bit of thought into why certain characters would hold certain beliefs, and instead we mostly hear opinions that are both disagreeable and unfitting. Lastly, we need to talk about how Season 2 is basically the last time period-typical racism and homophobia make an appearance. You could say a lot about how the bigotry is toned down pretty dramatically compared to the actual 1980s in America, but at the very least, it feels like a real threat to these characters, like something they actually struggle with in their lives. In later seasons, racism will disappear, and homophobia will be spoken about but never depicted. It makes sense. If they were to triple down on things like anti-black racism or anti-gayness being so prevalent in the 1980s, the audience might recognize that they're brushing uncomfortably close to topics still relevant today and become uncomfortable. Not to mention, it would obviously complicate their nostalgic longing for the time period. That's a big problem for the show, because from this point on, we've entered a new era of Stranger Things, the flagship programming era, and boy does that shift immediately make itself apparent in Season 3.
The postmodern nostalgia mode as described by Frederick Jameson, in which contemporary or even futuristic reference at the level of content obscure a reliance on established or antiquated models at the level of form.
Season 3 is arguably the most 80s of any of the seasons. It's where the 1980s aesthetic peaks. Not unrelated, but it's also the season that gets the most flack for being style over substance. And it's the one that pisses me off the most. Let's start with the surface level details because they're the easiest to speak about, but also because you kind of need to understand how this season uses brands and pop culture as iconography to define the 80s in order to understand how its deeper political implications fall flat. Season 3 is the first season of Stranger Things to take place in the summer, not during the fall. This is a weirdly important aspect of the season for me, not only because it frees the kids from school and lets them spend time around town, such as at the mall, we'll talk about the mall in a second, but also because it marks a departure from seasons 1 and 2's specificity. Remember before when I said that they were telling a story that took place in a particular time and place, and how it used the 80s to establish a setting, but the time period did not constitute the setting entirely? I think that it took place in the early 80s in a small town in the Midwest in autumn, and all of those are actually pretty important aspects of the show. It's not just the 80s. Season 3 is just the 80s. The fact that so much of the season takes place in a mall is no accident. Firstly, the 80s and 90s were the peak of teenage mall culture.
Families, friends, and of course, teenagers can come together to shop.
This was the era in which shopping mall and movie theater production peaked, making it a time-accurate depiction. But is it character-accurate? These characters are nerds who love video games and D&D and science. Is this specific to these particular teens, or are they just teens in the 80s, so of course they spend time at the mall and the movie theater? Now, I know a big theme this season is the kids growing up and tastes and personalities changing, so maybe you can defend it. But it's hard to ignore how convenient it is that they suddenly want to spend more time at the mall, because the second reason I think so much of the show takes place in the mall is for the brand tie-in opportunities. There is so much product placement this season in such inelegant ways, but the mall setting contextualizes it, making it seem realistic, even though it's no less obtrusive. Similarly, the pop culture references this season are what I would call out of control. The show starts with the kids racing to the movie theater to see Day of the Dead, a movie we can't rule out wasn't included just because it also takes place in a mall. Later on, Robin, Steve, Dustin, and Erica take refuge in a showing of Probably the most famous and iconic movie to come out in the year 1985, Back to the Future. And of course, they enter the theater during one of its most recognizable scenes, and also Robin needs to make a crack about Marty's mom kissing him because in-joke. What commentary does the show make about Day of the Dead or Back to the Future? Nothing, but they are mentioned. The music in this season too. There's a montage of Max and Eleven running around the mall set to Madonna's Material Girl, and I will say it's a very cute scene, but compared to how pop songs have been used in previous seasons, it's significantly less motivated. Before, pop songs that appear in the soundtrack have a diegetic tie-in to the story and the characters. The show uses music that the characters would have a connection with, or at least feels like music that they would listen to.
Who'd you rather be friends with? Bowie or Kenny Rogers? Oh, exactly.
But Material Girl was chosen because it's a scene where two girls are running around a mall. We also get Working for a Living by Huey Lewis on the news over Nancy and Jonathan at work, because they have jobs now. Foreigners, Cold as Ice, when Elle dumps Mike because she's being cold as ice. Weird Al's parody of My Sharona to reintroduce Mr. Clarke, the science teacher, because I guess he counts as like an epic cameo now. There's just so many needle drops that feel like they're supposed to be exciting because they're recognizable 80s songs, but they don't feel earned. They don't add anything to the show, they just scratch a part of your brain. There are also contemporary references worked into the story itself. The most obvious example is Hopper, who just like literally is Magnum PI this season. They tried to justify this by showing him watching the show on TV and then getting his secretary to buy him a similar shirt, implying that his clothes and mustache were in story inspired by Tom Selleck, but it doesn't change the fact that the writers decide to make him a walking pop culture reference for the entire season. There's an antagonist who's visually inspired by Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator, which is even worse because there's even less of a reason for him to look like that. Again, no commentary about Magnum PI or The Terminator, what it says about these characters of Hopper or the Russian guy. No, the characters came first, and a pop culture reference was painted onto them after the fact. Even if, in Hopper's case, it completely contradicts his established character. Miscellaneous other details include the styling, the perms are wild this season, there's women in jazzercise nylons and aerobics classes, even the colors, like the saturation itself, feels like a reflection of the aesthetic. Seasons 1 and 2, again taking place during the fall, look much more muted and earthy. 3 is filled with neons, high contrast, and bright lighting. Is it recognizable and visually pleasing? Yes, I would take this over the drab, boring look of Season 5 any day, and it's great for marketing. Does it fit the tone of the rest of the show? Absolutely not. Style over substance may as well be the subtitle of Season 3. But when we actually get into the substance of the season, meaning the plot, it gets worse, because it's time to talk about the Russians this season. Okay, so this half of Season 3, which interweaves with the plotline concerning the kids and the Mind Flayer and the Upside Down and, all the stuff that people actually watch the show for, is that the Soviet government has infiltrated Hawkins by bribing the mayor and built a supermassive underground base and lab underneath the new mall in which they conduct secret experiments to reopen a gate to the Upside Down. Hopper takes it upon himself to investigate, and Joyce and Murray get roped into it somehow. Also, Robin, Steve, Dustin, and Lucas's little sister Erica get kidnapped by the Soviets when they wander too close, and it's just the worst plotline and worst use of the Cold War setting in Stranger Things ever up to this point. In earlier seasons, the Cold War was looming in the background, a reality in these people's lives, but not really relevant to them because, well, it's a little above their pay grade. The most powerful character in the show is a small-town sheriff who's open about the fact that the cops never have to do anything in their sleepy little town. I think he'd be a little out of place fighting the Russians. But in this season, characters like Jim Hopper, Joyce Byers, Steve Harrington, and Dustin Henderson are directly interacting with high-level Soviet officers who are trying to kill them. They themselves kill multiple people. The US government isn't even present, really. Hopper tries to call his federal contacts for help at one point, but they decide that they're taking too long, so he and Joyce and Murray end up just saving the day on their own. Aside from the wild stakes of this season, the way that the characters talk about the Soviet Union and the way that the show itself depicts the Soviets is insane. Needless to say that the characters, particularly Hopper and Murray, spread a lot more fervent anti-USSR rhetoric this season. Previously, Hopper didn't seem to have much of an opinion on Cold War politics, or maybe I should say, he wasn't particularly passionate about those opinions. I'm sure he was mostly anti-communist, he was an American at the time. But it didn't come up much, and he seemed just as distrustful of his own government after he started unraveling the mystery of Season 1. But obviously a plotline with the Russians as the main villains give the characters much more of an excuse to get political with it.
Убери это с моего лица, ты лысая американская свинья. Я-то, может, лисы. А вот наручники на тебе, сволочь советская.
What's weird is that I buy the characters espousing anti-communist, pro-America opinions, even highly ignorant ones. But we can't pretend that these are just the opinions of the characters anymore. These values are now baked into the themes of the show itself. This show is presenting the Soviets as cartoon villains. They murder without mercy, including their own people, and kidnap and torture children. Their ultimate goal is to open up a portal to the Upside Down to use for Cold War purposes, with zero regard for how it will impact the rest of the world or even the dangers to themselves. There is absolutely no insight into the psychology of their motivations, they are allowed no sympathy. But once you get beyond their evilness, they're so stupid about it. They're played for comedy pretty often. They wear their stupid little outfits. They get outsmarted by a couple kids, a local mom, a crazed conspiracy theorist, and the small town sheriff. This doesn't even happen with the US government. Their representatives easily subdue Hopper and Joyce in season 1 when they try to break into the lab, and they negotiate with them to allow them to enter the Upside Down to save Will. Then they only die because of the Demogorgon and Elle's OP psychic powers. In season 2, the lab shuts down because of a series of bad PR stemming from their grave mistakes during season 1. With the objective of closing the gate having been achieved, it's actually pretty reasonable that they would just decide it's not worth it anymore and leave. There's also, especially in season 2, a slightly sympathetic angle to these characters, even if they still fit the role of the antagonist. They were doing the right thing in season 2. They know the Upside Down can't be controlled, and they're trying to close it. Plus, we get the character of Dr. Owens, who seems suspicious at the start of the season, like a fill-in for Brenner, but is revealed to be a genuinely good guy. In short, the way the show handles the American government as villains is realistic. It's taken seriously, it's allowed to be complicated. The USSR, cartoonish and uncomplicated. They're equally evil and silly, inept and threatening. It's exactly how you'd expect the propaganda arm of the US military to portray its enemies. Scary when we need to galvanize, but pathetic when we want to feel mighty. And now I gotta talk about how much I dislike the character of Alexei and probably get hate for it. But I'm sorry, I think this character is hack, just so totally hack. Alexei is a Russian scientist working for the underground base that ends up kidnapped by Joyce and Hopper. He eventually becomes an ally in their mission to take out the base, and he and Murray make plans for when he defects to the United States and becomes an American. He also loves Burger King, Slurpees, and Looney Tunes. He even spends a joyous evening at the town's funfair carnival, which Murray calls the height of Americanness. So to summarize, this is the one sympathetic Russian character in the entire show thus far, and he's obsessed with American culture, brands, and products, and plans to abandon his entire country and make himself an enemy of the Soviet state to move to the US. After being kidnapped and abused by the only Americans he meets, by the way. Oh, and of course, he dies after getting shot not by one of the US soldiers who raid the Russian base, but by the Soviet Terminator guy for being a traitor. Did this not feel like a humiliation ritual to watch? Now this feels like a real 80s movies moment. It's so propagandistic, so big, bad, repressive USSR. Yes, of course, Alexei is impressed by novel American concepts such as burger and sugar slush and games. They don't have anything like that over there. But honestly, I'll get back to this element when we get into season 4, because it won't even be the last time that Stranger Things does this trope. The character of Alexei, and arguably the entire Russia plotline, is an excuse to work in pop culture references, product placement, and straight-up nationalist propaganda all at once. It's strange to see a show that was once critical, however lightly, of the 1980s federal government embrace what is basically official state narrative about the Cold War. If I had to guess why this change occurred, I'd say it's because the Duffers wanted to work in the Soviets as villains. Because 80s. It's time. Let's talk about the capitalism of it all. In case you aren't aware, the 1980s marked the start of the era of neoliberalism in the United States, defined by tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations, decreased government spending and social programs, and mass deregulation. It was economics guided by the philosophy of rugged individualism and anti-communism as official state policy. For decades, the general public's understanding of the 80s has been one of economic prosperity, largely because the late 70s were defined by such turmoil in comparison, and because it would take decades for the end result of Reaganomics to make themselves apparent. The mall setting ends up a representation of the era's consumerism and corporate worship.
A growing patriotic community and a shining example of the American dream. Today, Hawkins is taking another step into the future with the brand new Starcourt Mall.
In many ways, it's an interesting setup, and it seems like the series is going to do something worthwhile with it when they oppose the large corporate Starcourt Mall with local small businesses, and show Nancy being critical of its economic effects and the town mayor being numb to the sentiment of his constituents due to the financial kickbacks he will get from the mall opening. I mean, the season ends with the mall being destroyed, along with the giant monster that's been terrorizing all of our characters this season. On paper, it seems like a pretty anti-capitalist message, or at least anti-this era's capitalism. But no, it is not that. It's interesting that while the show stops taking anything political seriously this season, it does explicitly discuss capitalism in the dialogue. If I had to guess, I would say that the show's sillier, lighter tone made the writers feel comfortable making such comments because both they and the audience don't feel the need to take them as seriously. Or maybe the writers just felt confident because they knew they weren't going to say anything even remotely subversive at all. Erica Sinclair is one of the characters who mentions capitalism by name, and she just extols its virtues while she feasts on a mountain of ice cream.
You know what I love most about this country? Capitalism. Do you know what capitalism is?
Yeah.
It means this is a free market system, which means people get paid for their services depending on how valuable their contributions are.
The scene is meant to demonstrate how a capitalist economy supposedly functions. She has something the other characters need. She can fit through the air vents to open up the gate to the Russian base from the inside, so she can negotiate for whatever she wants. Free ice cream for life. In this scene, we are a little annoyed with Erica because she's being difficult, but she's ultimately shown to be correct, and her explanation of how a free market system works goes unchallenged. The setting is also important. She is enjoying the products of capitalism, the ice cream, at the mall, literally surrounded by other consumer businesses. Capitalism produces choice, variety, and prosperity. You might complain about it, but look how fun it is. There's another scene in which the show is weirdly pro-capitalist. Murray and Alexia are at the carnival, about which Murray says, "Fatty foods, ugly decadence, rigged games, it doesn't get more American than this." It's a trick that we Americans use all the time, pointing out the quirks or faults in our culture in a way that sounds like a denouncement, like self-deprecation, but remaining deeply protective of that very culture. Underneath Murray's ribbing is a love for this kind of decadence. America in the 1980s is functioning so well that we can enjoy all of these excesses. In many ways, it's just like the mall, tacky and consumerist, but boy, we wouldn't have it any other way. But there's more. Murray's claim that the games are rigged is proven to be false. He says that the games present the illusion of fairness, that they've all been fixed to put your money in the rich man's pocket.
Друг есть America.
It is exactly how a critic would describe capitalism or the American dream, the illusion of upward mobility and meritocracy, but in reality, a system where the rich make the rules and only ever get richer. But Alexi wins the game on his first try. And then he runs over to Murray screaming, "The game isn't rigged!" So I guess the American dream is real. He is then immediately shot in the chest by the Terminator. The way he's set up, so excited and naive for a new life in America, then uplifted by proving that this game, which is an analogy for American society, is actually fair. You'd think he's about to learn the hard way that his view of the US is entirely wrong, like he'll get mistaken for an enemy by the feds and then be arrested or killed. But no, he gets shot and robbed of his glorious second life in America by a fellow Russian. US, good guys, Soviets, evil. In summary, Season 3 is the most in line with the sentiments of the 1980s. It holds the most pro-capitalist, consumerist, anti-communist, nationalist attitude of any season, and it plays all of these elements straightforward and without criticism. Does the show poke fun at hyper-consumerist culture with them all, or nationalism with the town fair? Sure, but portraying something in an exaggerated way does not inherently equal criticism. And the way it pokes fun at these aspects of the 80s are with love. I said before that Season 1 similarly utilized some 80s tropes pretty straightforwardly, but that it worked in that season because it's not really the focus of the story. Those tropes were used to tell a personal story about those specific characters, and the bigger themes and characters overshadowed the use of some tropes in a way that you might construe as almost lazy. But in Season 3, the bigger themes and characters suck. In many instances, directly because they have been modified to fit various tropes. Everyone says Season 3 is meant to be an homage to 80s tropes such as the Russian villain, the 80s action hero, the T-800 itself. But I think there's a difference between direct recreation and homage. An homage adds something new. It should ideally highlight what the creators think is so interesting about the thing that it's emulating. All I got about these tropes from this season, as well as the contemporary music used and the movies and TV, is that the Duffers think that they're neat. Genuinely, I don't think it's because this is the Duffers' secret conservative leanings coming through. I think it's genuinely that they didn't think about it. They're probably not very political people, and they've never really considered the political implications of the entertainment that they consume or create. But that's not great either, because you want the writers behind the art that you're watching to put some thought into what they're making. If we assume that all political or even just social messages in a work are unintentional, that's demoralizing.
Present popular type of nostalgia, to be referred to as melancholic, is usually of this unprogrammatic, wistful mode. Proponents of this mode intend no major criticism of society, nor do they desire revolutionary action.
So season 4 is the one that I have the most conflicted feelings about, and the ways that it uses the 80s setting is no exception. It's much more interesting than season 3. It's almost like the writers decided to put an actual effort towards understanding the setting and how these characters would interact with it. Let's return to that question after we discuss the story. If season 3 focused on one social element of the 80s, consumerist, capitalist mall culture, season 4 chose a different trend to highlight, the Satanic Panic. However, this was a choice that seemed much less random and much more specific to these characters and the spirit of the whole show. I would highly recommend this video section on the Satanic Panic and how it pertains to this series' themes of outsiders and minorities being misunderstood by the wider culture. And also just the rest of the video, because it's really good. Various cultural trends led to an explosion of accusations regarding Satanism across the 1980s and early 1990s. This included a change in the way that society treated child abuse, and particularly child sexual abuse, clinical psychology's obsession with repressed memory recovery, growing panic over suicide rates among young people, and conservative Protestant Christianity dominating mainstream politics and culture. Much of the US felt understandably guilty and disturbed for neglecting the serious issue of CSA, and were concerned in the wake of rising teenage suicide rates, which led to an overcorrection, or maybe I should say the wrong elements of culture being corrected. Most child abuse occurs in the home, but the 1980s was the era of Christian family values and the family as the most sacred unit in society. It felt much safer to externalize all of these anxieties and target those who were already marginalized.
We were confronted with the fact that sexual abuse was occurring within the home, which is, I think, statistically where it's most likely to occur. We couldn't see the father as dangerous. And the solution to this was not questioning the nuclear American family, where the father is in charge and where we have this power dynamic. You know, the horror that we now feel for the figure of the child molester in America, we couldn't quite do it. As a society, it seems like during this time, we had this lofty goal. We wanted to take our children seriously and protect them and understand the threats that were in their lives, but we also were quite sure we wanted the threat to be outside the home.
The Pokemon trading card game is a new collectible card game that is made and distributed by Wizards of the Coast. What is a wizard? Male practitioner of black magic.
The end result? Unrelated adults such as daycare workers being accused of leading satanic child-abusing cults, and mental health issues among teenagers being blamed onto their indoctrination into Satanism through media such as heavy metal music and fantasy games.
There's overwhelming evidence showing that a lot of teenage suicides that are caused by Dungeons and Dragons are caused because the player has finally lost touch with reality.
The very end of season 3 shows a news clip that touches on a possible rise in Satanism, the first time that the Satanic Panic is mentioned in the show at all. But season 4 makes it a central element of the story. New character, Eddie Munson, is the exact picture of what the moral panic warned about. He's a long-haired Dungeons and Dragons playing drug-dealing metalhead. He's also 20 and mostly hangs out with minors, which is only because he's still stuck in high school, but you can also see it as being used against him. This character was pretty clearly modeled after Damien Echols, who, if you weren't aware, was an 18-year-old in West Memphis, Arkansas, when he was arrested along with 2 other teenagers in 1993 for the murder of 3 7-year-old boys. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to die after a trial and media circus that heavily focused on his interests in heavy metal music and Wicca, and his habit of wearing black. There was no physical evidence or key witness testimony that connected any of the 3 of them to the crime scene. The media, as well as families of the victims, absolutely ran with the narrative that these things made him a Satanist, and him being a Satanist made him a murderer and a pedophile.
Do you feel that the people that did this were worshiping
Satan? Yes, I do.
Why?
Just look at the freaks. I mean, just look at them.
He and his co-defendants would later be freed from prison under an Alford plea after public backlash against their convictions increased and further exculpatory evidence of the crime came to light. They had at that point served 18 years in prison. The West Memphis murders themselves influence the central plot of the season. Eddie Munson, through unfortunate circumstance, ends up the number one suspect of several murders around town at the time. The character of Eddie is widely beloved by fans of the show. It makes sense, since he's witty and Joseph Quinn is very charismatic in the role. He also has a very clear aesthetic. He's part of an iconic 80s subculture that had up to this point been absent in the show. His character fits right into the show's habit of celebrating the geeks, the losers, the outcasts, those who often get bullied. For a lot of viewers, he almost became a patron saint of the misunderstood. Personally, as a character, I think Eddie is a mixed bag. I think the Satanic Panic brings a lot of value to the show, but I think that the deliberate choice to create a new character for this purpose was a misstep. For season 3, I said that the show was wrong to paint an 80s trope onto existing characters. This season, however, I have to say, it would have made more sense to explore the accusations of Satanism through the characters that we already know and love. Can you imagine how hard it would hit if instead of this new character getting accused of being a Satanist murderer, it was like Dustin, or Lucas, or even as Kath Clarke says in her video, Jonathan? I don't think it would have felt out of place like the cultural references in season 3 did. It would have actually made a lot of sense given that these are characters who have been misunderstood and bullied, are into D&D and alternative music, and generally view themselves as outsiders to the mainstream. It would have been strong course correction after season 3 got so far away from the characters and the original heart of the show. But that's not the biggest issue I have with how season 4 uses the Satanic Panic. My biggest issue is honestly the wasted potential and lack of resolution. So much of the season is spent establishing the Vecna plotline and other stuff. As a result, the much more grounded human story about the town reacting to the unsolved, seemingly ritualistic murders of young people gets pushed to the sidelines approximately halfway through the season, and, most importantly, never gets a real resolution. But a lot of time is dedicated to the whole town getting whipped up into a frenzy over Satanism. The bullies feel like an actual threat instead of just a nuisance. The parents of the main characters are all involved for the first time. The show really leads you to think that it's going to explode at some point. And the only way it pays off is that Jason, the main human villain, meddles in the final battle, resulting in Max getting killed, but also not really, and thus the gates opening. Outside of this one guy, this plotline actually goes nowhere when you think about it. Eddie may have been accused of being a murdering cult leader, but he probably would have been accused of Chrissy's murder anyway. She was found dead in his trailer after all, and then he fled. The real damage done by the Satanic Panic is heavily watered down. You think the show is going to go hard on the evangelical Christian sensibilities of the time and the illogic of moral panics, but at the last moment, they pull their punch. The season ends with all the characters coming together in the wake of the gates opening and destroying much of the town, the implication being that the seriousness of the event taught the town to move past petty squabbles like the panic over the Hellfire Club. I've seen people argue this, that yeah, the town seems to forget all these kids are supposedly in a satanic cult, but it makes sense because they have bigger fish to fry. In reality, though, real-world tragedies and disasters tend to push people even further into their existing prejudices and conspiracy theories. Given that this event was specifically the gates of hell opening across town, I think it would only add to anxieties about the supposed child-murdering Satanist cult that everyone is now 100% convinced exists. It's very strange to me that the show set up these villains, who would be cartoonish if not for the fact that they were literally based on events of the time, and still felt too shy to really dig into them.
So the big idea was this. Children all across the world, but especially in North America, were being kidnapped, abused, and murdered by satanic cults. There's a huge underground network run by the most evil of evildoers, and they are coming after your children to appease their bloodthirsty, unquenchable god of terror and temptation. That is the core idea behind Satanic Panic.
I mean, they're accusing kids of murder because they play a fantasy game. We can't call that out. Maybe it's because they don't want to talk about why people fell for this moral panic, the cultural forces behind the trend, how the politics of the era normalized it. And maybe they don't want to depict just how harmful this chapter of US history was. Teenagers were abused because they were believed to be Satanists. Innocent people were tried in court for satanic ritual child abuse that never occurred. Many parents were led to believe that the reason that their children took their own lives was because they were indoctrinated by Dungeons and Dragons. Damien Eccles, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin spent 18 years in prison for a triple child murder that they had absolutely no connection to on the basis of little more than the fact that Damien Eccles wore a lot of black. And none of these things were isolated instances. None of these things were cases where one town got whipped up into a frenzy and it all blew over in a couple months. This was happening across the country consistently on a mainstream level for more than a decade. But when you talk about that kind of stuff, it makes you reevaluate this entire era. It colors the way that you look back on the fun times of the 80s. The hair, the clothes, the banging music. The ugly, complicated reality colors the nostalgia that you can feel for all of that. The areas of the show that held the most promise became casualties of the show's new commitment to nostalgia generation above all else. The level of wasted potential makes me question how much thought was actually put into this season, and specifically the choice to touch on the Satanic Panic. Like, maybe it was brought up randomly because that social phenomenon, like the Cold War and consumerist culture, was just another thing going on in the 80s. Maybe it was an accident that ended up fitting these characters and this show so well. Having to wonder that makes me sad, but I do, because the rest of the season, outside of the plotline with the murders in Hawkins, is so much worse. So Hopper is in Russia now. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the storyline, because this show handles the USSR roughly as they do in Season 3. The only big difference is that the tone is much darker, leaning into the scariness of the Soviet Union as opposed to the silliness, basically removing all humor from Hopper's storyline. But the pro-American, anti-Soviet messaging is just as present. There's even a Alexei element. The character of Yuri smuggles goods from the US into Russia due to the lack of trade.
Cigarettes, peanut butter, Playboys. The best America has to offer.
Did you know peanut butter is banned in motherland?
Embarrassing. Boo, this is embarrassing. Oh yes, the USSR is so oppressive, they don't even have peanut butter. Bro, they don't even have peanut butter in Spain. I once fed a Spaniard peanut butter and they hated it. And that was natural peanut butter. That was Smucker's. He's smuggling Jif peanut butter. That shit's 90% palm oil and sugar by volume. If you gave it to any child that isn't American, I think it would single-handedly radicalize them against neoliberalism. Given that this season explores the flaws of contemporary American culture, specifically conservative culture, you'd think they'd be more comfortable questioning nationalist propaganda on the Cold War. But they never really go there. Hopper has every opportunity to make some kind of connection between the abuse he's faced by his own government and what he's suffering in the Russian prison. He was, after all, tortured by his own government in Season 1. They were fully prepared to fake a suicide and cover up his death just because he knew too much. He also knows for a fact that these same people held his adopted daughter captive and tortured and exploited her for her entire young childhood. But in his long-ass monologue about his backstory and all he's suffered, he does not make any mention of how both governments have used and abused regular citizens. In fact, when he does bring up his time in the Vietnam War, another great example of how the US government wronged him, he doesn't blame his own country for sending him to fight and die and suffer for a conflict that he has no stakes in. He actually tells Dmitri it's because of commie bastards like you.
Charlie's moving south like a plague because of commie bastards like you and...
Yeah, I don't think the communists were the ones exposing you to Agent Orange. So I think it's safe to say that despite the season taking a more serious tone in general, it isn't actually any more interested in interrogating the commonplace political attitudes of the time than Season 3 was. Getting to the season's attempts to cash in on 80s nostalgia, let's check in on the show's use of pop culture. Okay, so it's not nearly as bad as Season 3. There's obviously a stronger horror lean this season, but it feels more like homage rather than recreation, similarly to Season 1. The horror elements, even when you can tell where they took inspiration from, are used to tell a genuinely interesting and suspenseful story. There's also the aesthetic details, the nylons, the perms, the entire roller rink scene, Eddie's metalhead look, of course. It's in general not too much of a departure from the last season, but it does feel less intrusive. It just makes sense. These 80s teenagers look like the stereotypical 80s teens, Eddie belonged to a popular subculture at the time, these aesthetic details are not the focus of every scene when they're on screen. And then there's the music. Music is a critical element of this season, and I mean in the actual plot itself. The key to escaping Vecna's grasp is listening to your favorite song, or at least a song that you have a strong emotional connection to. It's a great excuse to have major set pieces within the season play out underneath whatever contemporary pop song the writers choose. And the idea that music grounds you so well that it literally delivers you from evil, that's an idea most viewers can get behind. It's a pretty badass idea, just wild enough to have that Stranger Things whimsy, but also reasonable, because Vecna is a serial killer that strikes by invading your mind, and music affects our brains in a way that little else does. It also does so very efficiently, almost like a shortcut to your neurons. Not only is it useful for resisting the mental attacks of interdimensional demon Vecna, it's also a potent tool for filmmakers, therefore one that they should wield very judiciously. Because if you overuse music, particularly familiar existing songs, not only will the audience pick up on what you're doing and feel manipulated, but you could desensitize them to the point that it undercuts all future attempts to use songs in your movie or show. The running up the hill scene is a great use of existing pop music in a scene. It's one of the better editing choices in the show, and it's memorable for a reason. But I unfortunately think that Stranger Things learned the wrong lesson from the response to this scene. It's true that the song contributed to the scene's impact, But the writers seem to think that the use of a powerful song is the magical formula. The emotion of Max's arc this season, the suspense created by having seen Vecna murder several other teenagers the same way, the fact that we love this character and don't want her to die, it seems like none of these mattered nearly as much as one pop song. Kate Bush is carrying a lot of the emotional weight across the finish line, but it would be meaningless if we didn't have half a season and 2 whole seasons before that of establishing Max's character and arc. Not to mention the editing and cinematography, which we know to be true because in the next season we will have on paper the exact same scene minus the quality of editing, cinematography, and writing, and it sucks, even despite the presence of the exact same song. No, playing a good song is not the end-all be-all to unlocking the viewer's emotion and attention. This isn't the only scenario contrived to emphasize the importance of music this season. At the end of the season, we also have the Master of Puppets scene, where Eddie performs the song on the top of his trailer in the Upside Down in order to attract the demo bats away from the Creel house so that the others can break in and kill Vecna. It's very epic. The scene goes hard on YouTube when you watch it in isolation. I mean, it also goes hard in context. But when I set aside my partiality towards Metallica, I have to admit that it's a little indulgent, especially when the drums and vocals kick in despite those obviously not being diegetic to the scene. I feel like I'm gonna get a lot of people disagreeing with me here, but while I think that there was justification for popular music to be used against Vecna, this scene felt a lot more transparent. They wanted Eddie to play his guitar one last time, and they wanted to play an iconic song over the final battle to close out their season. Do I love the song and the accompanying visuals? Sure, I like music, but that's why I listen to music. This is a TV show. I didn't purchase a Netflix subscription so I can watch the world's highest budget music video. It certainly didn't ruin the episode or the final battle, but it was a sign for me. A sign that this season, despite being better than 3 in many ways, is not above what I would honestly call cheap tricks. Not saying that they're bad tricks, not saying that they're ineffective, but they're just cheap. And this would have major consequences for the 5th and final season of Stranger Things.
What then dawns is the realization that no society has ever been as standardized as this one, and that the stream of human, social, and historical temporality has never flowed quite so homogeneously.
Season 5. This is firmly after Stranger Things stopped being a show that premiered on Netflix to being Netflix itself. If it was born out of genuine 80s movie nostalgia, it is now being propelled by purely profit-minded purposes. If it once contributed to that nostalgia, it has now wrung every last bit of cultural cachet it can from the trend. The distinction between seasons 4 and 5 is actually wild. As flawed as season 4 was, you could tell passion was put into the filmmaking and at least some thought into the story and the characters. But by the last season, the exhaustion is apparent. The Duffers don't seem to want anything to do with the property anymore, and the other writers, if they cared much more, lacked the authority to seize control of the story. It's very sad to see how this impacts the characteristic that the creators were once the most passionate about, the setting. There's so little to say about the time setting in season 5 because this season is, in general, the least of all seasons. The least meaty, the least interesting. One of the only ways that the 80s are used at all is a few pop culture references, including, most prominently, in the soundtrack. 4 taught the writers that music is the key to tapping into the viewer's emotion, which isn't entirely untrue, but by now, the trick has turned cheap. We get I Think We're Alone Now by Tiffany, Fernando by ABBA, obviously Rockin' Robin, because Robin. Some of the pop songs are diegetic, some are just in the soundtrack, but they all feel closer to season 3's gratuitous needle drops than the much more measured mixture of original score and existing music in the early seasons. For example, we of course have the reuse of Running Up That Hill. I don't have anything to add to the criticism of this episode 16. It is egregious, it is just another example of the show being both lazy and way too confident about all the wrong things. The recipe worked well the first time. If we do it all over again exactly the same way, it'll work again. And the writers ended up just embarrassing themselves. But they also invented new ways to justify in-universe use of pop music. The example of the show engineering such situations is the final battle against Vecna and the destruction of the Upside Down. Mike designs a bomb fixed to a record player, playing a particular song triggered to explode when the song is finished. Well, surely, if they are doing something so random to justify the presence of a pop song in their finale, they must have a great choice in mind. It ends up being Prince's When Doves Cry. What an interesting and odd choice to close out the final action sequence of the show. It's a great song, of course, it's just not really climactic for this purpose, nor does it have any relevance to the characters or the themes of the show. But if you know anything about the backstory of the production, you'll know the choice was made largely for marketing purposes. The Duffers hyped up the needle drop prior to the finale even airing, explaining that it marks the first time the show was licensed for TV or film. I guess the marketing value of the reveal and the creators' egos count more than the integrity of the scene or its effectiveness. Then, finally, we have the closer to the entire series, David Bowie's Heroes, which has also been used in the show before. In fact, it's been used twice before, and this is the second time it's been used to close out a season. I'm gonna be real with you, I hate this choice. It's not just that it's overused in this very series, it's also extremely overused in pop culture in general. I love it, but I also loved it in Perks of Being a Wallflower 13 years ago. In 2025, it elicits absolutely zero emotion in me. I feel like it was the first option suggested to play over the end credits and ended up chosen because it was the easiest for everyone to agree on. It caps off the end of the series in a fitting manner for the rest of the season, lazily and with very little thought. I will be the last to say that yes, the aesthetics of season 5 are awful. I don't know why the hair is so bad across the board, I don't know why there are no memorable outfits when previous seasons all had at least a few, I don't know why the cinematography itself ranges from boring to straight up incompetent. Remember when I said that season 3 not taking place during autumn contributed to its aesthetic departure from previous seasons as well as the loss of some specificity to the story? Well, season 5 takes place during fall again. It's one of the many ways that the season tries to retread its past successes, to play the hits, so to speak. But if they didn't keep reminding you that it's the 4-year anniversary of Will's disappearance, would you even recognize this season? Where are the chunky sweaters? Where are the pumpkins? Season 2 gave us a whole pumpkin mystery subplot. But for real, doesn't everything that appears on screen feel so unpurposeful? There's also no identifiable 80s trends or cultural phenomena utilized this season like the Satanic Panic was in season 4. 5 is much more concerned with the fantastical sci-fi elements of the fight against Vecna. The only subplot they have really any time for beyond that is the military occupation of Hawkins, which itself was like the 10th opportunity for the show to explore the themes of state violence committed by the US government, but no, it does not. There is really no more political commentary in this entire show by this point. Will comes out as gay in 1987, and none of the 13 characters who hear this news have so much as a conflicted reaction to it. The show takes place throughout the 1980s, Will supposedly facing homophobic bullying and deep-seated anxiety over his own sexuality for much of it, and the AIDS epidemic is not mentioned once. Lucas experiences racist bullying in seasons 1 and 2 and violence, with the implication that his status as a black boy in Hawkins, Indiana, is part of the reason that he is something of an outcast. But by seasons 4 and 5, not only has he overcome that racism, but racism among the popular kids in high school appears to no longer exist. Why? Well, because this is a blockbuster adventure show now. The 1980s are a background aesthetic. It's invoked whenever the filmmakers want to wring some nostalgia out of an old song or movie, or to give the show some kind of unique identity for marketing purposes. But the characters don't live in the 80s anymore. In fact, it doesn't feel like they live in any particular time or any particular country. Like, this character's president is Ronald Reagan. This character's president is Ted Sarandos. They live in streaming land, a dimension out of time and place where not only does everyone talk like they're in a bad MCU movie, but racism doesn't exist, sexism and homophobia are easily overcome with quippy one-liners or a group hug.
I don't trust doctors who smoke. Or call me sweetheart.
And partisan politics are avoided at all costs. The series has become so generic, there's no room for its very place and time to matter. Even the pop culture references are pushed to the literal background. You know the last time I can identify the time period being reflected in the plot? Not even the last time it mattered, but the last time it showed up? It's the marquee outside of Hawkins Theater, briefly seen in one shot that reads Indiana Jones of the Last Crusade. It's the last pop culture reference in the series, and it's the name of a movie used to establish that the year is 1989. That's what the 80s have been reduced to, an establishing shot. But not one that gives you any information about the characters, or the place, or the themes. Rather the fact that the local theater is showing a movie that came out that year. We know how time works, guys.
A sticking point in returning to classic film and television is the need to look around outdated mores, but we should perhaps be wary of such revisionism. Erasing history's unpalatable aspects does the past and the present a disservice because it creates a narrative in which social progress is seen as an inevitable force, rather than a hard-won and ongoing battle.
At the start of this video, I contrasted the earlier seasons with the later seasons, presenting a dichotomy. What the later seasons of Stranger Things failed at, the first few did very well. Stranger Things was a show that once felt like small-town 1980s, whether or not it was a strictly accurate portrayal. I stand by this. But I must also admit that despite clearly being inspired by 80s movies and TV, it isn't actually anything like an actual 80s show. It took the tropes, the cliches, the music, the content, but the form? It's modern filmmaking all the way, ever since the first episode. And you can go and test this for yourself, because Netflix has done something really interesting. They listed the entire first season as a separate property called Stranger Things VHS Special Edition. Rewind and relive the first season with a video store vibe that's glitchy and grainy and gloriously vintage, just like you'd have rented it in 1983. And if you do what the streaming service wants you to do and rewatch the whole first season, you'll notice that it doesn't feel like an 80s show at all, or like an 80s movie. They put a literal filter over the first season to try and wring some more nostalgia out of you, to try and make you feel like they have that same 80s magic, but it doesn't change the fact that the first season, good as it was made in 2016. So truly, what did the first 1 or 2 seasons do that the later seasons didn't? In an article written after season 1 was released, Mike Bartlett pointed out the significant gap between real 80s TV and Stranger Things, and wrote that the latter takes itself seriously in the sense that it doesn't allow its borrowed trappings to undermine the integrity of the drama. In other words, it's not so loyal to the 1980s that it's going to deliberately utilize out-of-date filmmaking techniques or off-color slang in the dialogue. Well, conversely, the last season of the show is so loyal to the property, to itself, to the brand, it undermines the historical setting. And it does this when the story is no longer near good enough to justify it. As simple as it is, I think the shift is due to just lack of care. I think in 2016, the writers loved 80s movies, and they hadn't yet exhausted their supply of good 80s tropes to tap into, and all the people involved wanted to be there. By season 5, it's an obligation for all involved, and they're probably as sick of 80s hair as we are. Not only does it not feel like an 80s property, it doesn't even really feel inspired by them. It felt aggressively modern. It felt like a Marvel movie. Considering that passion for the 80s is what inspired the original 8-episode miniseries, so that it was in many ways the soul of the story, should we be wondering why season 5 felt so soulless? To be clear, I don't think that modern filmmaking that seeks to depict the 1980s should try to feel like movies or TV from that era. That could be said for depictions of any other era too. TV and movies and advertisements from the past are not an accurate portrayal of real life during that time, so similarity to those texts is not a good standard for accuracy, if accuracy is what you're going for. And, if I'm going to be honest, I don't think filmmaking exactly peaked in the 1980s. I get that we're all nostalgic for some of the cheese of that era, and there were certainly some bangers from the time, but for the most part, I don't think that John Hughes movies are the peak coming-of-age stories or teen comedies. I don't think the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies or martial arts films were the best action movies. I definitely don't think the many mushy romance epics or historical biopics that took critics by storm were even all that watchable. In comparison to the 1970s or 90s, which were artistically much more diverse, gritty, and daring, the 80s just felt like they had a lot less to offer. Which is probably why, portrayals of the 1980s don't try to emulate the tone of these movies, just the visuals. Maybe there's a reason the 80s produced less interesting art. It was an era of relative stability and economic prosperity in the US, at least for a couple of years there. It was also characterized by a firmly right-wing government and the rise of evangelical Christian conservatism shaping mainstream culture. These aren't the kind of forces that push and enable artists to take risks in their work. There are exceptions, of course. Rambo First Blood tapped into anti-Vietnam War sentiment to create a pretty anti-cop and anti-military action movie to great success. And weirdly, I think the original Footloose is the closest thing we get to a contemporary rebuttal of the repressive conservative culture policing teenagers during Reagan's administration. But most works of the era, they don't rock the boat. Modern works that depict the 1980s aren't subject to the same circumstances. I mean, the same forces certainly exist, but they don't have a stranglehold on the filmmaking industry. There's much stronger opposition sentiment to tap into. A mainstream anti-capitalist movie wouldn't play in 1989. But in 2026, I think audiences would be a lot more receptive. I've buried this lead here, but allow me to say, the 1980s were not a great time in America. It was defined by the continuation of Cold War proxy battles that destabilized the Third World, mass incarceration and the war on drugs, economic policies that slashed social protections for the poor and disenfranchised, rampant racism in mainstream politics, and virulent homophobia in the context of a barely mitigated AIDS pandemic that ripped through the gay community. It, up there with the 1950s, is among the most whitewashed eras of our history. Modern-day art has started to dissect the decade and its ugly underbelly, but none of these complicated issues are brought up across 5 seasons of Stranger Things. Are they explicitly relevant to the story? I mean, that last one kinda is, and, racism, especially anti-black racism. But even if we say no, that's all too political for this science fantasy adventure that has included government figures as villains since the very beginning, I would respond with, why the hell did we need the USSR in this story? What's the relevance of that? More importantly, what's interesting about that? What are you adding to the story of these characters and their interactions with the supernatural in a Midwestern small town in the 1980s? But it doesn't have to be this way. Season 1 showed that the show can address the interpersonal and internal struggles of different characters in a way that was realistic to the times that they were living in, while still portraying otherworldly supernatural threats as scary and exciting, all while capitalizing on the common nostalgia we all seem to possess for the ambiance of the 1980s. So let's return to that Reagan-Bush sign. If Stranger Things Season 2 were made with the same mindset as Season 5, if instead of coming out in 2016, 1 year after the popular first season, it came out 9 years after the show had become Netflix's most popular cultural export, I don't think the filmmakers would have included this shot. I think it would have been too delicate to depict one of the main characters' families as being supportive of something as divisive in the 2020s as Reagan's presidency, even though it would have been very realistic for the time. Netflix and the makers of Stranger Things themselves have, and I hope it's not too controversial to say this, made clear that they are not interested in inspiring deep debate on touchy issues. Over 5 seasons and 9 years, any remotely political commentary, whether it be on race, sex, sexuality, nationalism, jingoism, have been stripped from the show. Not saying that these issues are entirely absent, but they have been rendered completely toothless. Because we can't offend anyone. This show is watched by Republicans and Democrats alike, by would-be Reagan households, and by viewers who would be offended to learn that most of the characters from their favorite show would have likely had positive impressions of the guy. To depict something as complicated, as multifaceted, as ugly as the 1980s in America is a task that this show is no longer up to. They aren't even interested in trying anymore. And why would they? You can't say anything offensive if you don't say anything at all. Or can you? Because I find contributing to the whitewashing of one of America's most oppressive nationalist conservative eras in the context of the rise of our next most oppressive conservative era under unprecedented levels of warmongering, xenophobia, racism, and Christian nationalism pretty gross as well. Even if the filmmakers are too irresponsible and inept to realize that that's what they're doing. And even if you disagree with all that, maybe you'll agree that lazy writing can be pretty offensive as well.
The reason that focus groups and capitalist feedback systems fail, even when they generate commodities that are immensely popular, is that people do not know what they want. Rather, the most powerful forms of desire are precisely cravings for the strange, the unexpected, the weird. The effect of permanent structural instability, the cancellation of the long term, is invariably stagnation and conservatism, not innovation. This is not a paradox. The affects that predominate in late capitalism are fear and cynicism. These emotions do not inspire bold thinking or entrepreneurial leaps. They breed conformity and the cult of the minimal variation, the turning out of products which very closely resemble those that are already successful.
Do you notice any symbol up there that you've seen before? The spiral. And it stands for what? Male fertility. Gotta catch them all. Gotta get them while they're young. And Brock is by far the most hormonal. His tail, it's a lightning bolt, and it's a satanic Z. Gary is a real self-centered jerk. He's vindictive and he's obnoxious, playing this game, watching the cartoon, reading the books, looking at the videos. And it says Cabal Ghoul. Now, in case you don't know what a ghoul is, you have no purpose, because all your purpose was for the last 10 to 12 years was playing Dungeons and Dragons, and that's what a ghoul is. This is Mew over here, M-E-U. He's kind of cute. All the kids on recess go outside on the school grounds, pick up huge sticks, wave them in the air, and say, "Spirits, enter me." And this is Mewtwo over here, complete with his satanic salute. Remember I said that they get their energy through energy balls. Powerful witchcraft symbol, and it's a symbol for fire. Hail Pokemon! And what are they actually hailing? Satan. A New Age symbol, they call a New Age symbol for Earth, which is a green leaf. And now you notice he's not quite so cute anymore, and his little satanic tail is really erect. And down at the bottom here, this blue ball down in here is the symbol for energy of water. And water transforms into wind. Earth, wind, and fire